This is BIC camera of Akihabara. And this is the day I decided to buy a Panasonic brand newly introduced Palm-In, is what they called it, LamDash shaver, which is essentially a Panasonic Arc 5 shaver with no handle, basically. You hold it in your hand. It's extremely convenient for travel because it's very compact as a result. The battery used is a compact unit, but supposedly will last 2 weeks, once a day, 3-minute shaving. So I suspect it will only last about a week or so. I've owned the Panasonic Arc shavers going all the way back to early 2000, I believe. After trying a series of Norelco and bronze shavers, I happened upon this idea of a wet-dry shaver that you can use in the shower. But really, the best use of the wet-dry technology is to clean the unit itself using soap and water, rather than a series of proprietary, expensive shaver cleansing soaps, detergents, and machines, irrigating machines, sold by, I believe Braun was the initial. So this LamDash Palm-In shaver incorporates that wet-dry technology so that you can rinse, clean it with soap under your hot water tap conveniently and free. Soaping mode, when you hold the bottom button down for 2 seconds. I think you can see how I calculated the current exchange rate at that time. The shaver cost me about 261 US dollars, which is a good deal compared to the $430 it would cost at Amazon at the same time. I had also looked at this shaver at Yodobashi, which is near the same block, but the pricing there was slightly higher than that BIC camera. So since I've been using the shaver, I've been quite satisfied with it. So here I am taking a subway to the Asakusa area. It is an all Japanese only, highly rated, near 5-star rated Tonkatsu shop. They serve black pig from Kagoshima. Very thick cutlets, as you can see, absolutely delicious. And crafted by that middle-aged guy over at the top right, served by 2 assistants. And I'd never had tonkatsu of this quality ever before. The seating is, as you can see, just 8 at the bar, and I believe 8 more behind me at the seating areas. They serve it to you in a set, as I ordered it, with a few side dishes and this cabbage over which you can apply either of 2 salad dressings. I'm applying the sweet one here. So here I'm trying to relish eating it. It's quite a bit of an uncomfortable environment because you're surrounded by these strangers who don't acknowledge nor talk to each other too much. I suppose if I spoke Japanese, I would talk to them, but I notice these Japanese folks, they don't talk to each other at all, either. Japan, quite a bit more than Korea, are autistic and a bit asocial compared to Koreans. They prefer it that way. They like to play alongside each other, but they don't really play with each other so much. They'll interact with each other only in absolute emergencies, it seems like. So this was an absolute delicious lunch of approximately, I believe it was below $20. And there you see the setup of the restaurant. Notice that there are no non-Japanese speakers at this place, at least when I was here. But very formal group of owners, quite friendly actually, I thought. So afterwards I do a walkthrough of Asakusa near the shrine. I had been to this shrine the day before, or it was 2 days before, something like that. But I had walked through this area when it was early, 7 a.m., 8 a.m., and utterly empty. And now I wanted to see what it looked like when I walk through and it's utterly crowded with tourists. So after all the stimulation of walking amongst hordes and crowds of Tokyo and Seoul, which was very much a implosion therapy for kind of avoidant, asocial people, I'd gotten quite used to this mode of living again. It's actually the type of living I did at my earliest memory, ages 2, 3, 4, 5. And I lived in Seoul after we returned from Uganda, Kenya, back in the late 60s to live in Seoul again. And during my college times, I would live in this extremely densely populated city environment again during college. So I found I can very easily accommodate to this mode of living and quite content, quite comfortable in this environment. Now, upon my return to my desolate suburbia, I found a sense of void living here. So I've returned to my seat at my desk, often watching the adventures of others on YouTube and Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute. I'm not sure if it's a sense of envy or a sense of fear of missing out, a sense of wasting of my life that I'm doing. Just sitting here, but after, what is this now, a week? After a week of just puttering around the house, contemplating, ruminating, the act of living, the state of retirement, really nothing left to do for me. I find myself, at least to some degree, missing the travel experience again. So it's one of those things that you always want what you don't have. So when I was in Korea, when I was in Japan especially, I couldn't wait to leave Japan. I was so exhausted of it all, so tired of it all. Now that I've returned, now for well over a week, of course that first week, a lot of, oh, I'm so glad to be home type of feelings. But now, I find myself once again with regrets, things I should have done, or things I wish I did more of, one of which is, I guess, more walking about, various things I missed, I didn't see, various things I did not buy that I wish I did buy, things of that nature. But anyway, I was considering that traveling, because it's such a concentrated mode of living, and you're incentivized to live more intensely, seek novelty more than when you're just sitting at home, because of the money you spent, the effort you spent to get to that destination, versus just sitting at home where you normally do nothing much than sitting at home. So is this novelty seeking and this concentrated mode of living, is it something that's valuable, or is it decadent, almost like a degenerate activity? I have a cousin that I met when I was in Seoul, who travels to Japan, he says, every month, at least, he says. He's fairly fluent in Japanese, and he has unlimited money. Basically, his dad started and owns a major company that's listed on the stock market that put in environmental and air conditioning units into just about every skyscraper in downtown Seoul, going all the way back to the 1960s. So he is the equivalent of, I don't know, Carrier, Lennox, a number of companies like that, all in one. So they developed over the past 60 years or so into this juggernaut. Not quite a Chebble, because he did not expand out toward other areas of the economy, but he focused his efforts on just producing the best units, best service that you can in that endeavor. And as a result, nearly a monopoly. Nobody uses any other company but his dad's company, essentially. His dad is now over 90, and he still is the chairman of that corporation. So my cousin has never really worked seriously in his life, except for maybe a brief period of time, maybe 1 or 2 years, where he, with connections, worked in the recording industry, which is what he was interested in when he was younger. That was decades ago, and now he spends most of his time just pursuing his hobbies. When I asked him what his hobbies were, he couldn't really say too much about that. But the only thing he mentioned was that he goes to Japan every month, mainly because I was talking about how I had returned from Japan. So, not quite sure what he does when he goes to Japan. It could be a number of degenerate pursuits, possibly. He's very much into food and wine and things like that. I'm sure that's one part of it. His mother was a heavy-duty, and still is a heavy-duty, art collector of the great masters. Paintings of great masters line the walls of his home. I don't know if he's ever interested in that, though, but if I had unlimited money like that, what would I do? Is that what I would pursue also? Just travel to specific locations. Now, with all the money he has, he does not travel as extensively as you would think. He has very particular interests, and he has very particular and multidimensional angst and anxieties, and so he's quite autistic, more than I am, I think, although he would deny that. He has multiple degrees. He has studied in multiple well-known universities throughout the world, Edinburgh, Paris. um, as well as Seoul University. So I don't know how many degrees he has, but that was one of his hobbies early on, study. Um, so if I were in that state where money was unlimited, would I do much differently than him? Not so sure. I believe the amount of money I have is adequate for me to pursue most of the things I enjoy. One of my friends slash family, it's actually a friend, but his dad was the best friend of my dad, and his grandparents were the great best friends of my grandparents, and this goes on for over 1,000 years. So my dad told me this particular person was like more like a family than a friend. But this friend that I met when I was in Seoul tells me that money is poison. More than beyond a certain amount, money is poison. He also inherited great wealth from his dad, who was involved in real estate early and capitalized tremendously on the real estate explosion in Seoul between 1970s and 2000s. He also experienced many tragedies. And he states that money is not to be used in degeneracy. He is quite religious, in fact, and I suspect he donates very much of it every year to the Catholic Church, for instance. But the way he lives with his unlimited money and the way my cousin lives with unlimited money, somewhat surprising. You would think that with unlimited money, you would do a lot more. You would live a lot more, want to experience a lot more. What really happens is that when money becomes unlimited, your life perhaps becomes more focused, like that idea of a clam burrowing deep into the earth to preserve your life, to not risk your life, to live safely, to try to live long as possible. That clam style living idea. Perhaps that is what everyone eventually converges onto when you have unlimited money, rather than this adventure seeking, which is essentially risk seeking behaviors. So I again confirmed that that is possibly what happens once you have unlimited funds, unlimited money. In many ways, I can see why one can think like that. In my final days in Tokyo here, as well as my first days in Kyoto, I began to develop that feeling. Now, 10 days into my travels, of just becoming bored of it all, the ennui of novelty. It's a mix of kind of exhaustion, just being tired of it all, tired of travel, tired of that similar feeling of the crowds, the lines, the sameness of everything. Despite this novelty of everything, the sameness of novelty was becoming tiresome. So this idea I've seen in many different venues throughout my life. There's a repetition There's a repeating pattern to traveling around the world and seeing tourist sites. All have a hard to put your finger on sameness to it. It's as if they all copy from the same template, and I believe they do. It's a way that tourist sites converge on the same idea on how to capitalize, how to parlay their tourist site into money, I guess. As a result, their sites are often decorated or festooned or laid out in a way that they believe best would attract tourists to their site. So they will ward off, the homeless people, possibly in cahoots with town officials, the police department. They would eliminate unpleasantness in their site grounds. They'll tend to make things appear new and renovated to the best that they can. They will try their best to add purchasing venues throughout their site. Multiple areas where you can buy souvenirs. Picture taking zones, if they could pull it off, especially at towers and skyscrapers. They'll have you take pictures by so-called professionals, and they would try to ask you to pay whatever $18 for that, for a print of that at exit, and try to prevent you from taking pictures of their pictures, which is absolutely forbidden. And then, of course, at the last exit, just like in Disney World, Disneyland, they have the extravaganza souvenir shop where almost everything that you can imagine can be purchased at a high price. So this pattern, this template of tourist sites are laid out just like Disney World and Disneyland. There's a long line, there's the ride, and then the souvenir shops, the series of souvenir shops. You see this repeated again and again throughout tourist sites, throughout the world really. Especially Japan, they've really gotten that pattern down everywhere, to the point where once you notice that, you can't unsee it and it becomes tiresome. That's what I'm talking about. I guess copycatting is a basic human trait. But the way tourist sites copy the way things are done at the top visited tourist site, they become a repeating pattern. So, for instance, in Kyoto, when I visited over a dozen temples, well, that's what I noticed, that almost all temples, except for one, all those temples that I visited were exactly similar in layout, visit pattern, similar ticket price as well. So you go in at the gate where there are those demon, goblin guardians. You view through an arched or a doorway, a gateway. You view the main hall, within which is the golden or giant wooden or whatever Buddha, and where the main monks would worship along with their followers. Toward the sides are various shrines. And often in the center is a central cleared area made to appear iconic or enormous or imposing. And at either side there are also souvenirs that can be purchased. There are offerings where you throw dimes and wishes and fortunes that purchase for $5 or less throughout the temple grounds. And as you exit the temple, there's always a souvenir shop where you can purchase everything from magnets to pins, food items, etc. The same template over and over again. It does get tiresome after a while. It tends to make you get jaded toward temples in general and begin to see them as money-making endeavors, which really all religion is nothing but a money-making endeavor by the head priests and priestesses and monks. The whole point of it is to extract money from the commoners, us. All of travel, also the travel industry exists to collect money from your pockets. The money is set at the market rate comparable to all other sites visited by tourists, at least in that area. And so the touristing and the traveling industry is a money grift. It's just a money grift, really, to some extent, if not entirely. It all begins with someone who begins to consider how they can make money when they have nothing to offer. No talent, nothing else they can do to make money. And then they have this idea of presenting something as a site to visit. And often they would go around, research how other sites have become successful. So it makes sense that they would copy that template that was evolved over generations of sites like Disney World, Disneyland model. Even in the 18th century, there were travel thoughts. There were people who traveled the world. This is described, for instance, in E.M. Forster's A Room with a View. I think it was Lucy who travels Italy carrying a Baedeker guidebook. So that type of industry existed way back to then, and probably earlier among the wealthy people. And then, therefore, as those areas saw more and more of those people, it would make sense that they would open up restaurants for them, hotels, inns for them, eventually an agenda for them to follow and see. And at each agenda, they would be in cahoots to extract money from those wealthy patrons. And that's how it developed and evolved and was honed to a fine point of tourist extraction, money extraction machines. It's to the point of really nausea. Like when you visit Disney World, it's an entirely plastic created world where all outside drinks and food is forbidden. You must buy every drop of water within the park. You must eat at the park, unless you want to risk exiting the park, going back, to finding your car at this immense labyrinthine parking lot. Very difficult to park and very difficult to hike to and from the gate from, just so you can avoid Disney food. But of course, the surrounding areas around Disney World are also populated by Disney restaurants and Disney nightlife areas, and are all equally heavily overpriced. So it doesn't make too much sense to leave the park, really. You're going to be paying just about the same hundreds of dollars to eat, to feed a family. So it's hundreds of dollars a day to eat, hundreds of dollars a day to be in the park. And of course, they try to extract hundreds of dollars from each of you in their multiple and infinitely arrayed souvenir shops. They also have that system where they encourage you to collect certain things. Like they have these Disney personnel arrayed in ribbons festooned with pins, each pin costing $5 to $20. And they encourage, especially young kids, to follow their example in collecting pins. And so I remember 2007 when we were there, both of our kids got involved in collecting these $5 to $20 pins. And each of them collected up to over $200 worth of pins by the end of it. Absolutely disgusting. And these are pins that once they got home, they never looked at, even twice, ever again. So this is the example set by Disney World. Kind of a grasping, money-grubbing, really an evil, money-grifting empire is what Disney is. So I'd been to Disney World maybe 8 times in my life, going all the way back to when I was 6 years old. I went to Disneyland when I was when I was 5 years old. I went to Disneyland near Sacramento, I believe. And not Sacramento. It's that city that begins with A. Anyway, at the time, I believe Disneyland may have been more naive, innocent than it is now. Of course, now it's just become disgusting. Disney World. I first went in the early 70s, soon after it opened. It wasn't nearly as crowded. And the commercialization of it wasn't nearly as bad. It was quite magical, actually, in the 70s, Disney World. Which is why I went back to it again and again. I went with my high school class in the early 1980s. And even at that time, it was decent. But the last few times we went, they were all absolutely disgusting experiences. The lines were just uncontrolled. For instance, the line at there was one ride called Soarin'. Is what I remember that line the most. Because we stayed in that line because at the end of the day it was the last ride that we were going to do for that day, and it was at the Epcot Center. That line must have lasted 3 hours for a brief virtual experience that was hardly worth it, really. That's an example of the Disney World experience. You come out of there onto this immense souvenir shop where you're supposed to buy little Soarin' items, as if that means anything anymore, because it doesn't. And then after that, after several of those types of rides, now there was a life hack in visiting Disney World. One of the keys is to statistically list the rides you want to ride in combination with the most popular rides. For instance, the main Disney World, at the top of the list should be Space Mountain, for instance. And you list them in order that you want to ride them, the popular rides. And you arrive at the Disney World gates before they open. I believe it was like 6 a.m. or something like that, 6:30 a.m. And as soon as it opens, you run with your family as hard as you can to Space Mountain. And you notice there are a handful of other people who learned of this hack, and they are also running toward that ride. And when you get there, there's no wait, of course. You go to the head of the line, immediately ride it, get it over with. The ride only lasts a few minutes anyway. As soon as you exit, you run to the very next ride. And that ride also, when you get there, will have very few people in line, if at all. So anyway, by the third or fourth or fifth ride, the lines become subsequently longer and longer, but not nearly as long as when you arrive to the park midday or mid-morning. So the waits get longer and longer, but by doing that, you front load the most popular rides at the beginning of your visit. And what we found was that in the first, 45 minutes to an hour ago or so, we had ridden the top 5 rides already. It was over with. Back in 2007, it was like something like Space Mountain, the Toy Story the Toy Story ride or something like that. Haunted House. Anyway, I forget what all they were because it's been nearly 20 years now. But with that hack, we were able to negotiate Disney World, Epcot, MGM Studios, Animal Kingdom in a similar way. It was actually much more pleasant than most of the other Disney World experiences I had previously, where it was hours and hours of waiting in line for each ride. So tourist sites are similar in that way that Disney World is, in that the most popular tourist sites are absolutely inundated with visitors, often from China, Japan. And these people are extremely pushy, shovey, and unself-aware, inconsiderate, unempathetic, non-sympathetic to others. Because they live in these enormous 1 billion population crowds and hordes, they have no mercy toward other humans. There's no sense of give and take with these people, with the Chinese people. So when these tourist sites are absolutely inundated with Chinese people, it's a very unpleasant experience. I found that I first experienced this phenomenon in Canada, various sites in Canada, which is absolutely inundated with Chinese people. But of course, it's not particularly Chinese. I'm sure any country of the world that is so populated, India, Africa, Brazil, their people always behave like that. And I've seen that in cruise ships. A lot of Brazilians at Royal Caribbean cruise ships, I noticed, wealthy Brazilians, that behave in a similar manner as well. So there's all kinds of unpleasantness in this way toward the travel life. The hordes of people, the crowds of people, and their ugly behaviors. The tiresome, redundant, repetitive templates of these tourist sites. The money extracting nature of these tourist sites. The kind of boring repetition of that same pattern. For instance, if you visit multiple temples, multiple shrines, multiple skyscrapers or towers, you see the same pattern over and over again. Maybe some people like these patterns, but after a while you begin to realize, what's the point of trying to see all these places? They're all the same to some degree. That was the feeling I had. That was the thought I had as I was visiting these places. So that's the feeling I got by the time I was in my last day in Tokyo here, wandering the crowds. So that's just to explain what I meant by this tiredness and novelty. Because sometimes novelty is novel, sure, but in a very similar way to other novel experiences. That's what I mean by that. So, how do you then come to terms with spending so much money traveling. I guess afterwards, in retrospect, you try to focus on the good of it, the delights of it, rather than the ugliness, the ennui of it. And after a long period of time, you recall the good moments, the delightful moments of travel, much more than the negative moments. You tend to suppress the negative moments in travel. The more you're able to successfully do that, the more you're likely to become what they call a travel thought, I guess. Those travel whores who, in a degenerate way, travel about the world like an addict, like a drug addict, addicted to heroin, looking for that same hit over and over again. So what does it mean to be a degenerate? The term degenerate meaning an atavistic return to a previous primeval, primitive state. So we see animals, let's say the bonobo monkey, for instance, addicted to self-pleasuring non-stop. That is a degenerate condition. The humans who become degenerate are returning to that type of pleasure-seeking degenerate condition where higher modes of living are ignored to exclusively focus on that pleasure-seeking principle. So children have that pleasure-seeking principle where their lives are entirely focused on pleasure-seeking only, and will cry at the first moments of non-pleasure. So that state of the initial state, the primitive state, the older condition, that's where the term degenerate means. You have degenerated to a previous condition, either a childish, infantile condition or a ontogenetically pre-existing condition like the bonobo monkey, bonobo ape. So you do have to be careful to not overdo some things, to not overly become dependent on the pleasures of certain things. That includes traveling about the world, throwing away your money at it. Because ultimately, living is living, and sometimes just staying in place is the best way to live. That's attested to by people who can afford to live infinitely, travel almost infinitely, but choose not to do so.
ありがとうございます。